Hey, what's going on, fight fans? We're here. Another edition of us talking some boxing history stuff. You know what it is? 86 Boxing in the Mexico, along with Random Acoustic Thoughts. What's going on there with your random?
Big up 86. Thanks for having me, man.
No problem. Hey, it's always a pleasure having you in the mix here to share your insights, being the aficionado that you are on the boxing history and such. And this is a special one right here because we're going to be diving into a subject that is sure to have interest, is sure to have people looking different ways in terms of just trying to gain an understanding. Some may have an understanding, some may want to get more insight, all that good stuff. But we're going to be talking about the color line in boxing. As a matter of fact, random someone had dropped by my page. As a matter of fact, they left something on a shorts video. They asked what the color line was. So I figured, what a perfect place to start right there. Just kind of diving into the color line, sort of as you know it there, random.
So the color line, put simply, is the refusal of Caucasian boxing champions in the early gloved era refusing to face colored fighters at title level. Some of them had already fought across the color line before they were champion, but once they got there, they drew the line. There were a lot of them, a lot of challengers, including the rival champions. So you'd have colored champions, white champions, but a lot of the white press would just write about the white champions as the champions. So the reporting is uneven as well because of sort of the racially tense underpinning of the time, in a sense. Like it wasn't a very sympathetic time, and there was even school of thought with some writers hoping that when the black boxers would just quit the game, get out of it, leave it to the white guys. Even though we know a lot of the greatest fighters of all time, majority of them are American boxers of African heritage. It's just what it is. Go down your modern greats and your past greats. There's exceptions, of course, but back then they didn't want to know, and they didn't want to put it. They didn't want to put black people in a position in society at this time, just decades after emancipation. They didn't want to put black people in a position of strutting around thinking they're better than anybody because they were still being held down. And so I guess that was the justification behind it. On the face of it, in reality, they just didn't want that matchup. And so some guys, they just drew a color line at a certain instance, which we'll bring up when you bring up one of your charts there. So we'll get to that later. But yeah, that's in essence what it is. The refusal of a white champion to face the colored champions and unify the title lineages. And so if we start, the last thing I'll say, so if we start in the gloved era, we go through all the champions, the colored champions, the white champions. You have two undisputed champions leading, with Joe Louis being the second of them, Jack Johnson being the first, briefly, and then Joe Louis going all the way back in the gloved era. Those are your two undisputed champions. If you really want to get technical and confront the history like baseball's done, the Negro Leagues, like they've confronted that. The records have changed. They've recognized in the greatness. If boxing were to do that, then you got to rewrite all that undisputed nonsense. You're looking at Jack Johnson at the end of 1908, leading into 1909, at which point he wasn't fighting his rival colored fighters. So they started basically a new iteration of the colored championship. So you did have at one point Jack Johnson like a guest in the white heavyweight division, and then the colored championship was being fought between great fighters, all-time great fighters in the heavyweight class: Sam McVeigh, Joe Jeanette, Sam Langford, and later Harry Wills. So that's why it's important to recognize both of these championship lineages, because they're great fighters scattered on both sides of the color line. And even some guys who didn't get for one reason or another, whether they instigated or not, who didn't fight across the line a lot, could still have great careers. So it's not to tear anybody down. It's just to be honest about the decisions these various athletes made. And it was easier to say some BS like, oh, I ain't going to fight a black man back then than it is today. Like today, you get stuff like Hopkins, Calzaghe, I'll never let a white boy beat me, and stuff like that's mild. No one's saying we don't want black people getting uppity, getting a chance at this heavyweight championship. They are less than. You know what I mean? Like, if you say that out loud now, you can have some issues.
Right. Good points right there, Random. Appreciate you sharing that. Yeah, and I'll further on that, kind of before we dive into the meat of things right there. But you did bring up a good point. One of the things that I want to point out is in relation to sort of the substantiation of title reigns or what was deemed or who was deemed to be the champion, the person, or the anointed one. And of course, some fights were fought and all of that stuff. But I have to bring up the National Police Gazette because they played a major role there. If you look at any controversy surrounding John L. Sullivan in his designation as the first undisputed world heavyweight champion of the world is going to tie to that. But in general, his designation as the first world heavyweight champion, and this is something that has been brought up on the channel in previous iterations. There was a battle between Sullivan, the National Police Gazette, which was the leading paper of the time in terms of the leading media organization, I guess you could say, documenting anything associated with claims or recognition as this person being the man to beat the man, so to speak, or whatever it may be. And we'll dive into it a bit further, but they played a role not only in the title that is what we know to be the lineal title, but even prior to sort of that unification, which was mentioned there by Random, as far as Jack Johnson when he was the reigning world colored heavyweight champion when he defeated Tommy Burns. Tommy Burns was the world heavyweight champion, which at that time or prior to that point hadn't been competed against a person of color. So therefore, that in a sense is where this undisputed notion comes about. And if you look at it for what we deem to be undisputed, that is the most logical fit there because at that particular time, there was no question, regardless of whether you think Sam Langford, Joe Jeanette, or whomever would have beat Jack Johnson had they fought when he became world heavyweight champion. But there was no question at that particular time that the number one black heavyweight in the world or a colored heavyweight. So this could have been a heavyweight of any color, but no question it was Jack Johnson at the particular time that he fought Tommy Burns. And he had already fought Sam McVeigh. He had already fought Joe Jeanette. He had already fought Sam Langford. And he had already fought all of the top black heavyweights that were around during that period. So therefore, when he fought Tommy Burns, this was the number one black heavyweight, number one colored heavyweight in the world at that particular time. So that's where this comes from in thinking about it from an undisputed standpoint. So if you hear that John L. Sullivan was the first ever undisputed world heavyweight champion, then that is something, regardless of what one may think, that can be questioned because at the time he did not defend his title against the absolute best world heavyweight champion opponents that were available. Not only was this the case as far as the black fighters, but if we wanted to dive further into it, this was also the case with the best white fighters or what would be deemed to be white fighters that were around at that particular time. So that's what makes it very interesting in relation to John L. Sullivan, though he is widely recognized and is the first world heavyweight champion. We'll give him that designation by virtue of the fact that he did defeat Patty Ryan, or well, he did defeat Patty Ryan for at the time what would have been the American heavyweight title. And what should have been deemed the American heavyweight title. And he did defeat Jake Kilrain, who at the time was the world bare knuckle champion. His Patty Ryan fight was bare knuckle as well, but they met on multiple occasions, just FYI. But that being said, this was in the bare knuckle world. And that's what gained him the recognition as world heavyweight champion, recognized fully by the National Police Gazette after he defeated Jake Kilrain in that fight in 1899. So I wanted to point those out. So this isn't just, we're not just saying it to be saying it. This is just coming with the information as it was presented, as we've researched, as it was there. And as we dive into it, Random, we'll talk about the Colored World Heavyweight Championship. We'll talk about the World Heavyweight Championship. We can even talk about the White Championship that was out there in a number of different weights. There was also a Black Championship that was out there in every weight. I say heavyweight because, of course, we know that's the marquee division. That's the main driver positions. And some of the lower divisions, they had unified fights where the best black fighter and the best white fighter fought for the title. You think about Little Chocolate George Dixon. Think about when others were able to pick up titles like Joe Walcott, first black world welterweight champion, right? So that came about, but it's the heavyweight division, the marquee division, which is the one that ended up being where there was sort of a lag. Not to say that it was the last from a unification standpoint, because that is not the case. We know Tiger Flyers became the first black middleweight champion, and that was in the 20s. But that being said, it's the heavyweight division that is the main driver, and that's where the topic tends to lie most right there, Random. Just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, like I can probably explain what. So the heavyweight division is the marquee division, especially at this time. Now, the less activity of James J. Jeffries did increase the attention on the lower weights, especially like lightweight, featherweight started getting a ton of attention. But the heavyweight champion was the man, the absolute governor on planet Earth, right? As far as the boxing fraternity was concerned. So it meant more, meaning the racial dynamic as far as how it reflects on society and people's own male fragility was amplified by the stakes were higher at heavyweight. And so that's why you could have George Dixon. They broke barriers. They had good managers. They broke barriers. You have connected guys managing you. You can get stuff done, right? It's like Tom O'Rourke. He handled George Dixon and also Joe Walcott for a time. And then Al Hereford had Joe Gans. So like these guys were plugged in. You couldn't just get your opportunity, but they did manage to break those lines. But then with heavyweight specifically, it was difficult because there's a lot of money. It's theater appearances and things. So a heavyweight champion, like say, for instance, I don't know, James J. Corbett, you can only defend that title once in all those years that you have the title because you're touring the South, drawing the color line, of course, especially because he's touring the South. That's his bread and butter. Dixie loved him. And you've seen Josh in the newspapers in the build up to the super fight, Jeffries Johnson in 1910. You know, Corbett was super down on the colored fighter. Like he was not happy, man. He was, he had some issues there going on, but he also had a really loud voice. He commanded a lot of respect with a lot of the writers, especially a lot of the white newspapermen. So it's hard sometimes in the written record to get. Some guys just don't quite get a fair shake, and you can sense the double standard, but it is what it is. We deal with it. But with the heavyweights, it was I was surprised to read in the press, Fitz, after he had beaten Corbin, had the championship, he said, "I'm drawing the line on Bob Armstrong." I didn't know Fitz drew the line. I've read these quotes from him like, "You got to fight everyone if you want to be the man," But no, he said it to the press. He was drawing the line on Bob Armstrong, but he would back one of his fighters against Armstrong for any amount. But he wouldn't give a title shot. He wouldn't unify. Actually, I don't even know if Armstrong was still the champion then, but he wasn't going to fight him. He turned down his challenge. When Jeffries beat Fitz, he did the same thing, drew the line. And it wasn't just the champions, right? So it wasn't just Denver Ed Martin and Jack Johnson calling out James J. Jeffries. It was Barbados Walcott, the welterweight champion, the little cannon, a little triangle of muscle, right, built along the most heroic of lines. He was challenging Jeffries. So was the ex-champion Denver Martin, even after he lost to Johnson in 1903, he was challenging Jeffries, turned him down. Sam McVeigh, the Oxnard Cyclone, red hot prospects. By 1903, he was challenging Johnson for the colored championship, and even after he lost the first fight, he was calling out Jeffries for a fight. So in 1905, he hadn't fought since 04, but in 1905, Jeffries retired, officially undefeated.
Mm-hmm.
The only mar in his record was like an exhibition where his last opponent before that retirement knocked him down, supposedly. It got the best of him in 4 rounds. But officially, as a professional fights decision, he's undefeated, citing a lack of credible challengers. But of course, he's drawing the line on a lot of really good fighters to, like in 1905, you have Joe Jeanette, you have Sam McVeigh, you have Jack Johnson, other guys still floating around. You got some good fighters in there and he's saying there's no one to fight. So we should acknowledge that there's some secondhand embarrassment reading back, like the excuses, but some of the newspaper men at the time weren't that sympathetic. Some of them wanted to see the top fights. They didn't care about all the other noise. They wanted sports. They wanted the best to fight the best. So, and that was true even amongst, like, say, where Johnson was trying to imply at times during his white title reign, ironically, he didn't want to fight Langford because there wasn't enough money in it. But it was like a huge money fight. It was like a top 3 or 4 matchup anywhere in the sport that could be made for years in a row. It was just a top. It'd be like people trying to say like Spence Crawford or something when the tension was there, or Pacquiao Mayweather, and it doesn't matter. Like, don't say that. It's huge. It's one of the biggest things that could be booked. Yeah, so but that was even between black fighters. So Johnson didn't officially draw the color line, but he didn't accept the challenge. He paid lip service sometimes. So I don't consider that the same as the color line. And he did actually fight battling Jim Johnson later in his reign for the title. So they fought to a draw. And but so Jim Johnson had fought like the championship of Europe, but he lost or drew at best most of his fights against the top fighters. Good fighter, but not elite. Just below that. Competitive.
I wanted to jump in there because that's a good point you bring up right there. And that's one thing I want to touch on as well, just from a broader standpoint in terms of Johnson and him. He did fight, of course, battling Jim Johnson, but he knew that wasn't going to be his stiffest test in terms of taking on the top black fighters that were out there and available at that time. And just in general, from a broader perspective, when you think about the color line, there are multiple layers, I guess you can say, towards it, because you have the color line when a fighter just didn't fight any fighter of color, or it didn't fight a black fighter in general, which is the case when you think about John L. Sullivan and his him coming up through the sport. Then you have the case where you mentioned random there in terms of where you had some fighters, they did cross the color line. There was no color line except for when the title was on the line. And therefore, that's when they then chose to be like, oh, yeah, no, I'm not going to defend it against this black fighter, though they had been in the ring with and fought multiple black fighters. So you mentioned Jim Corbett. Of course, he's one who he actually fought the man considered to be the best heavyweight at that particular time that was non-white in Peter Jackson. So they actually fought. In the case of John L. Sullivan, yeah, he didn't fight any black fighters there, though there was a point in which he was going to fight George Godfrey, which we'll touch on. But real quick there, Red, I want to shout out those that are in here. Shout out to Trey Titan, came through the mix. Appreciate you, Trey Titan. Shout out to Greek 1237, my man Joshua there. Appreciate you there, Greek, for dropping by, showing some love. Shout out to Brendo H3V, who dropped by as well. Appreciate you there, Brendo, listening in to the conversation. This is my first time seeing you in the mix here, but I do appreciate you dropping by. Hey, hope you'll continue to join. Shout out to Technique 539 in the mix as well there. So I appreciate you. Real quick, a couple of comments. Trey Titan mentions Murderer's Row is legendary. No doubt about it there, Trey Titan. We'll have to do something on Black Murderers Row at some point. I haven't done a direct video on all of them. I've done something on some of them, but that would be a good one. And I wish we had more footage history on Charlie Burley, says Trey Titan. No doubt about it. One of my favorites there, and someone that I show visually to maybe some younger fight fans or whomever who aren't familiar with guys who were able to apply a trade in such fascinating fashion back in the day there. Charlie Burley, one of those individuals. Brendo mentions following the lineage of Black Heavyweight Championship in the early 1900s is so interesting. So many great fights. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. There are so many there, Brendo. Appreciate you dropping by once again, as noted. And then the man Josh said the color line was mostly a heavyweight only thing. Indeed, there for sure. That's where it really had its loudest voice. And Joshua, also, I wanted to know, all of the color line was broken way before Gann's Dixon era. No doubt about it. And real quick, in that regard, so if you look at it, certainly, and someone had brought up London Pride. Oh, yeah, Joshua, you had brought up bare knuckle London Prize ring rules and all this stuff. If you look at those days, so the color line was certainly broken before that. When you talk about sort of the bare knuckle or London Prize ring rules world, you had guys like Daniel Mendoza. This was a guy who was, I guess, what they would deem Hispanic in terms of heritage. But Daniel Mendoza, he was one of those guys that was out there. But he was British, I believe. You had Tom Molyneux, or I think it was Tom Molyneux. He took on Cobb. I can't think of Cobb's first name right now.
Crib. Was it Crib?
Crib. Yeah, Crib. Sorry. Yeah, thanks, Random. Yeah, Crib. Tom Crib. They actually fought, and this was what was considered to be the two best heavyweights, I guess you can say, in the world at that particular time. So you've had these crossover fights that have happened. So this is something that kind of, I guess, took shape once again in the world of boxing with the Marquess of Queensberry gloves rules. And I think a lot of it was stewarded because of the reign of John L. Sullivan, and he opted not to fight any black fighters. So that certainly factored in there. You mentioned that, Joshua. Yeah, thanks for sharing there. And Random, you mentioned. So I wanted to point those pieces out there as well, Random. So this certainly took more shape and form, and certainly got out there more from a media perspective as we started to advance even more. When you think about it from a boxing Marquess of Queensberry rules standpoint, there in the heavyweight division, certainly they're starting under John L. Sullivan.
Yeah, and like people, just like today, what people say when they're trying to win a championship and what they do once they have it can change, right? Not all the athletes are like entirely consistent before and after. So that happened too, in the run up to after Jeffrey's retirement. And then, so the Kentucky Wonder Marvin Hart, who was like a middleweight turned light heavyweight turned heavyweight, he fought Jack Root of Chicago. That was his adopted, hometown. Yeah. And before the fight, Hart said he was going to defend against all colors. He was all comers. He was sure he was going to win. Then afterwards, he's like, I too draw the color line. But luckily for history, he lost his next fight to Tommy Burns. And Tommy Burns only had a money line. He was the win, lose or draw. I want that money. And so he fought some weaker competition and some better competition. He traveled the world. He was like a traveling champion, which was good for a heavyweight. That was sort of a landmark of sorts in the gloved era. And he almost fought Sam McVeigh in Paris shortly before he actually fought Jack Johnson in Australia, when Johnson was able to unify. So even though the money split was unfair, which is not unique to Johnson's title shot, a lot of people fell victim to that over the generations. But Johnson actually became undisputed, and what should have been the first undisputed colored versus colored fighter was booked for May at the National Sporting Club in London against the top contender, Sam Langford. But Johnson made other plans, and so Langford fought the English heavyweight champion and claimed that championship, knocked out Iron Haig in May. So we had that, and there were the other contenders, like one of the ways that Tommy Burns was legitimizing this new iteration of the championship that he'd taken from Marvin Hart, was go around and try to beat some national champions. And this is the same thing that like Jeanette, McVeigh, and Langford did, and other fighters when they were trying to get a title shot. They'd go fight for the championship of Europe or the championship of France. Like McVeigh on his headstone says, the idol of Paris. He was beloved there, you know, so he was like the French heavyweight champion. It was the sense of nationality as far as boxing was a little more fluid now than now. And after Langford beat Iron Haig, there was a discussion in the press. Firstly, had Johnson forfeited the title by accepting the challenge, you know, signing for the challenge with Langford and then not having it? Because generally, from what I've read, the champions were often given maybe 6 months to make their money and get their affairs sorted. Then they were expected to defend it. But Johnson had already agreed to a fight inside that timeline. So there was a discussion there. There was also discussion, can this guy from America who's Canadian, can even hold the English heavyweight championship?
Mm-hmm.
So, and then Langford was just trying to get the Johnson. He went elsewhere. You know, he didn't stay around to defend the English championship. So afterwards, you know, it wasn't necessarily recognized by them. And then they brought in the Lonsdale belts and eventually began their own new heavyweight iteration. But Langford was the last governor of England pre-Lonsdale belt at heavyweight, at least. So yeah, it's complicated, but they would say fight for national championships, especially like the English, French, and Australian. You've seen that, Josh, in your research.
Mm-hmm.
You know, or like say when Joe Gans was the lightweight champion after 1902, when he stopped Frank Ernie in Buffalo in 100 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
He his rival Jimmy Britt, who'd been like an amateur star in San Francisco, turned pro, beat two ex-champions, Kid Levine and Frank Ernie, which was very impressive so early in his career. He was like considered the Pacific Coast champion.
Yeah.
And he also claimed the white lightweight championship, but the press were resistant to let him supersede Gans' claim as the lightweight champ, even though Gans was fighting over the official limit.
Yeah.
In his fights, including the title fight, although it was only half a pound. But they were hesitant to just say, now you're the champ, because Gans needed to lose to somebody. And when Gans finally did lose on points, it was to Sam Langford, a fellow colored fighter, and didn't really affect the white championship, but it was used to attack Gans' credibility as champion. Now, Gans wouldn't actually lose the title till years later, but there was always that kind of drama swirling around. You mentioned John L. Sullivan.
Yeah.
When he got a little older, he was defending himself in the press saying, no, I was too a champion, because people were salty with him, you know, and he was like having to confront that years after, you know, when he was old and broke. But there was some good articles. They're interesting, but so like, you know, it's just like with anything, these athletes make the decisions they make, and that we're remembered accordingly. It just, you know, we're trying not to tear people down too hard, because, you know, it's a very difficult, dangerous endeavor, and there's always a ratio of like danger to money, and we're all humans. So like, yeah. So even though it's like a touchy subject, it's not to say you can't have one of these guys, your favorite fighter, like Fitz. A lot of people admire him for good reason, but yeah, sometimes in these instances, people made bad decisions, and that's just tough, man. That's what they did.
Yeah.
Even some of our heroes, you know, they've seemed heroic. They say never meet your heroes. When boxing, sometimes, you know, depending on what kind of heroes you're willing to put up with, it can be tough sometimes. But the fact that it's very difficult and dangerous and so entertaining and so high stakes, there is a prestige involved, even with its dirty underpinnings. You know, gambling and the entertainment and leisure industry, which is always attracts corruption. But it's just a great sport. So these guys, you know, a lot of them have baggage. Like Jack Johnson, a historic figure, but he was screwing up right. He was undisputed for like a couple months, but already in January, he'd already indicated he wouldn't be going to London to fight Langford. So some people were trying to say, well, he's not champion until he fights Langford.
Right.
And then that repeated itself after Langford beat Iron Haig. And I think Johnson canceled some theater appointments in England. He decided not to go because after Langford beat, I've seen people reference out after Langford won the English heavyweight championship. So yeah, so Johnson, even though he's a great historic figure and a trailblazer, he has his own baggage.
Yeah,
He
all
denied
these
a lot of
guys.
guys their opportunity.
Yeah, all these guys came with some form of baggage in some shape or form there for sure. Read them real quick. Want to shout out to Neo Bides in the building. My man Bides there. Appreciate you there, Bides. Good to have you in the mix here, bro. Gonna check us out on Boxing Chit. We're gonna try to do it on this Friday. Let's try to see what's up there this Friday, Bides. Get it back jumping off again. Appreciate you dropping by there, buddy. And shout out to Joe in the mix. Hey, Joe. Joe mentioned we know our boxing history, sitting back listening and learning. Hey, Joe knows his boxing history as well there for sure. So salute to Joe. As I mentioned, Joe, I've run into him on a number of quizzes over on Bruce Gass's channel, and Joe always wins. So he knows some
That's
stuff for
awesome.
sure. He definitely knows some stuff. So salute, respect Joe, no doubt about it. And always great commenting with you there in the comments there, having dialogue and such there, Joe. And real quick there, random, I wanted to mention before I bring up this graphic, but two things you touched on. You touched on the belts and kind of how some of the other ones are out there, Pacific Coast, you name it. But just from a belts perspective, I did want to bring up that's very interesting in itself as well, because while we mainly look at the world heavyweight title, for instance, and again, sticking with the heavyweight division, though there are other ones out there, middleweight and so on and so forth. But we look at the world title, certainly the world heavyweight title, but there are other belts out there as well that held prestige. And I kid you not, at one point, you can make an argument. This was in the 1800s. I would say probably the late 1800s. You can make an argument at one point that the Australian heavyweight title, from a competition standpoint, held more value, even leading into the 1900s. So I will say it's not just the late 1800s, but even leading to the 1900s, because you had people that were fighting in Australia, heavyweights like Langford, McVeigh, and all that. But it held just as much value, and probably even more so from a competition standpoint, than the world heavyweight title, because you had some of the absolute best heavyweights in the world that were present at that particular time, that were coming from fighting out of Australia, or if not Australia, right around Australia, in terms of New Zealand, Tasmania, this type of stuff right there. So you had the Australian Heavyweight Championship that was out there. New Zealand, Tasmania even had their own championship. But I did want to mention that, because that is worth noting, that, yeah, there are certain iterations in history where even the main title was not conclusively, or the holder of the main title was not conclusively the best fighter per se, you know?
Yeah, because there's politics, and you go back to Sullivan, that's sort of winner take all. You got to come up with this huge amount of money, and it's winner take all and stuff. Not necessarily pricing yourself out of the market, but certainly limiting how many people can even think about getting their shot. That did change, but it was tough. The money made it tough, and Fitz was all about the money. Lots of exhibitions. Corbett loved his money. Did not love making title defenses, but he how's the chick? In with the David. Hey, look at you.
Hey, Jared Hurd might have got it from me there, boss. You never know.
But I think.
But hey, he had it separated though.
So let me ask you, Josh, because you know that era a little better than me. So Larry Holmes, when he was the champion, there was another championship floating around, right? But he was considered the best. Was it during Holmes' reign?
Maybe there were two of them out there. Actually, I don't know that era as much as some others, like Joe and Boz.
Oh yeah, shout us out, guys, in the Joe and Boz and people, and also shout out to anyone who's in my chat. I can't see it from this screen, so sorry, folks.
Yeah. Oh yeah, you are connected. So yeah, I can't say with certainty, but I think there might have been another belt out there. Because what was that? Like there were two belts at that particular time, if I'm not mistaken, or I'm trying to remember when we got to that 3-belt era. But those in the chat, you may know during his reign, I can't say for certain, but I just know of course, what ended up transpiring in terms of him and Cooney being like the two I guess, top dogs there are considered at that one point before they met, of course.
Right. So you have instances where there's more than one championship, but one of the guys is pretty much recognized as number one. Joe Calzaghe. You know, like by the end of his run at 168, you'd be like, that's the guy. It doesn't matter about the belts at this point.
And Joe mentioned Page, Witherspoon. They all had belts when Holmes was champion, and Larry had given up the WBC title.
Right. So you have
Cutzia and Weaver. Yeah, I remember those two.
Right. So when Jack Johnson was the colored heavyweight champion, James J. Jeffries was the white or world heavyweight champion. You know, a lot of the writers and people considered Jeffries the best. They were both champions, but they considered Jeffries the guy, right? And so it's all throughout history. You have that. Sometimes you have splits in the lineage for one reason or another. And until it's resolved, but that people still have a sense of who the guy is. But you mentioned before about regional championships and things. You know, one of the great performances in ring history, Hairgreb's first fight with Gene Tunney, that was for the American light heavyweight championship. That's one of the most vicious elite versus elite beatdowns in history.
Oh, yeah.
And it's for a regional or national title
Gene Tunney.
Say
again? Grab Tunney, right?
Yeah.
Because we talked about that before. Yeah, good point. Because that was for the American heavyweight title, not the light heavyweight title of the world. But yeah, go ahead there, Random.
I'm trying to remember who had was it Battling Levinsky had the light heavyweight title at the time?
At that time?
I know Greb had beaten him while he was champ, but it was in newspaper decisions, so he would have had to stop him to take the title.
It could have very well been. If anybody knows out there, I could certainly look it up. It could have been Levinsky.
Also, shout out to, there were times when they had like white champions because of a dominant black champion in the early era. So, like with Jimmy Britt wanting to be the white lightweight champion, which not everyone took that serious. They did make note of the claim though. And then when Joe Walcott hurt himself in 1904, shot himself in the hand on accident, there was like a white welterweight championship that sprang up until Walcott came back and lost to Honey Melody, and then he pretty much had no claim at that point.
Good point, Random, and that made me think, because I had mentioned earlier there was a black heavyweight championship. Klondike Haynes had the black heavyweight title at one point, and he was saying that he was the best black heavyweight in the world. Now, it's one that never fully took shape in terms of, there were like, I think 3 holders, him and maybe 2 others, or it could have been him and 1 other, or something like that, but it never really took hold. It was never fully substantiated by any main media source or anything of that nature. But Klondike Haynes was going out saying that he was the top dog. And of course, Klondike Haynes, Jack Johnson did knock out Klondike Haynes at that particular time. I don't recall if Klondike Haynes was still calling himself, here, now that I think about it, I don't recall if he was calling himself the black heavyweight champion at that particular time, but he was knocked out by Jack Johnson, I do recall. Shout out Bruce Gass.
Big up Bruce.
In the mix.
Yeah, there was even some controversy as to whether Frank Childs had the colored heavyweight championship from Bob Armstrong properly yet, where he could lose it to George Byers. But then he got, Childs ended up with another claim. So Frank Childs alternately could have had 2 title reigns as the colored champ or 1 uninterrupted. So sometimes these claims, people make the claims anyway. I think it was one of Sam Langford's late career fights with Jack Taylor, maybe. It was billed as for the colored heavyweight championship, and there was no mathematical way that that claim could have been active for them based on their recent results. It's just, so there is a bit of a mess. It's not an exact science because you don't have a national commission. You don't have, it's like championship by acclaim. So that's how you can have like John L. Sullivan having to write to the papers all angry in like I think it was 1903, saying I was the champion. I was the champion, listing his whole stats, breaking down, giving his bio, explaining himself, so it's not set in stone. So like but it's really the fighters make the title. I mean, think about like, what was the lineage of the title when Bernard Hopkins and Roy Jones Jr. fought each other? That was a vacant title. There was no lineage. There was no beat the man who beat the man. It was an empty title, and they were the
That
two
happened.
hot shits, and they came up and had a great, a fight. But there was no lineage. So just because there's breaks in the lineage, it doesn't mean great fighters or powerful competitors can't get in there. In
Yeah.
fact,
Hey,
Calzaghe, one of my
Brandon, just want to say
yo
shout out,
yo
Bruce. I just had mentioned you there, Bruce. We were just talking about your quizzes there, and Joe winning all the quizzes on boxing history stuff right there. So good stuff there. Bruce is in the mix there. Be sure to go check him out, folks. Go follow Bruce Gas Boxing Jazz. I'm gonna try to be in that next one there for sure, Bruce. I know I've been saying that. I miss him. It's like, dang, and then I find out. And I'm not in the mix there, but I want to get there on time, right from the jump, But that's what Joe does this thing right there. but yeah, I was just mentioning that random.
Yeah. So there's a lot of claims. So like, I feel like it's a little different when they're setting up, say, a white championship claim, because there's the ones drawing the line. So they're like, it's self-inflicted. So I don't know if I don't hold that in the same esteem. But if the great fighters or championship level fighters have these various claims, I mean, it's just what it is. Because a lot of times back then, schedules were busy enough. They would have the fight, they'd resolve it, and there would be some money involved because of that tension. So it is what it is. But yeah, but like for the most part in the early era, at least at heavyweight, they just wouldn't unify lineages. So shout out to Tommy Burns for breaking the pattern and being willing to unify the lineages, even though it didn't stay unified. Because I think it was in February, Jeanette and McVeigh had the first of 3 fights they were going to have that year for that claim. So this was before Langford had fought Iron Haig in May, but after, a couple months after Johnson had beaten Tommy Burns and basically said, I'm going to do what I want. I think he changed managers too. He's like, I'm going to do whatever I want. And so very quickly there were people fighting for that claim, because that's the same thing when Sam Langford couldn't get fights at welterweight after Joe Walcott hurt himself, and he was like a top 2 or 3 welterweight in the world, and he just couldn't get. So he claimed the American championship, put up a forfeit, and then it's like, okay, made a claim. Can't claim the world championship because Walcott, some people thought he retired, some people weren't sure. And Walcott actually was booked to face Langford before he ended up actually coming back. He pulled back out of the fight. But so when it's difficult, sometimes you just make a claim, put some money behind it, and it is what it is. So it feels bootleg, but it's a sport that was, based on gambling, really. Like initially, like you're putting money up free against each other, winner take all. So often people are gambling around you. So it didn't come out of some clean, pristine thing.
And hey, real quick, random, since you brought that up, claims. We were talking about that. We can talk about the claims aspect of it as well, because I've had some arguments on the channel with, or in particular, I'm thinking about just one individual who was telling me that the colored world heavyweight title didn't exist. And what I was noting to him is that, hey, if you look at what a lot of this was substantiated by virtue of claim and media recognition, and them essentially tying their credibility, their recognition, their reach to a particular person and this person's claim as it related to a particular title. So that's a good point when you brought up claim, and I'm gonna bring this up, random this banner, because we hadn't touched on this as of yet. But these are some of the what if fights that Rendon and I were looking at. But I want to start with John L. Sullivan versus Peter Jackson. And of course, the majority of these are heavyweights, what ifs, but John L. Sullivan versus Peter Jackson, George Godfrey, C.C. Smith. And I want to touch on this because I think it's important and it ties to the overall claim aspect of things there, random, when you look at this. And I'll just dive into it real quick. So John L. Sullivan, what I was mentioning, of course, the color line, him not fighting particular fighters. Now, I have a video on the channel. John L. Sullivan in 1894 or 5, it might have been, or just it might have been 1893 actually. He fought Herbert Slade. Herbert Slade is of Maori descent. He's from New Zealand. You know what I'm saying? So in some sense, you could say that was crossing the color line to a degree. But Herbert Slade, he passed as white. He was this big guy who was trained under Jim Mace. Now Slade, when he came over here, he was out of shape, and realistically, yeah, he wasn't in condition to put up an effort that would have been actually feasible for him actually doing anything from a title standpoint. But I just wanted to throw that out there. Now, as it relates to John L. Sullivan, and I was discussing this with you random, I have a video on the channel, and it's asked, did John L. Sullivan take on the true greats or the true heavyweight competition? Now, this is an examination of things. This is not me going at John L. Sullivan, bashing him or whatever in the video. In the video, you look at the video, and it'll give you the insight on itself of the individuals that John L. Sullivan did not face during his title reign that would have added credibility to how good he was, how effective he was, and overall his greatness as a world heavyweight champion, right? Because that's what he was recognized as. I told you earlier, a lot of that was substantiated through the National Police Gazette. I'll say it. I'll just reiterate it real quickly if I could. Again, when John L. Sullivan defeated Patty Ryan at that time was the bare knuckle champion. And in defeating him, that made John L. Sullivan the American bare knuckle champion. So you can say Patty Ryan was the top American bare knuckler. Now, there are some who recognized it as the bare knuckle championship of the world. So you will see reports and things of that nature out there. I'm not here to determine or decide for you what you as an individual recognize it as. You could view it as being the world. You could view it as being the American. But I'm just letting you know from a wide recognition standpoint, it was regarded as the American heavyweight championship. Now, the National Police Gazette did not recognize John L. Sullivan as the world heavyweight championship. And even when John L. Sullivan went on to defend titles, he even beat Patty Ryan and Marcus of Queensberry rules, all that good stuff, he was not recognized by the National Police Gazette. Now, when Sullivan was on his rise, there was a fighter by the name of C.C. Smith, Charles A.C. Smith. You'll see that as well. You'll see C.A.C. Smith as well. This is a black fighter who ended up becoming, he was the first to claim the colored world heavyweight championship. And when he made this claim, he established himself, opened a challenge, which is typically how it goes when anyone is making a claim, to anyone in the world to come and take said claim from him, right? So he made this claim. Charles Smith was backed and substantiated through media by the National Police Gazette, Richard Kyle Fox. He actually put his financial backing behind Charles Smith, recognizing him as the colored world heavyweight champion, the very first, right? There was a point in which John L. Sullivan was 16-0 under Marcus of Queensberry rules, right? And Charles Smith was 16-0 with, I believe it was 2 draws at that particular time. And the National Police Gazette, by virtue of the public as well, they were clamoring for that fight between John L. Sullivan and Charles or C.C. Smith. And this would have been at that particular time, and it would have taken place likely in around 1881 or 82 or something like that. You would have had the number one recognized white fighter there, thinking about it from America's standpoint, against the number one black fighter there. And this could have happened. And Charles Smith even came to Boston, which is where the area where Sullivan's from. He's from Roxbury. That's where at least he was born. But this Boston area, but the fight never materialized, right? So I wanted to point that out because this was, because C.C. Smith's claim was established, or he had established the claim, and then it was recognized by the National Police Gazette. Lo and behold, John L. Sullivan, as I had mentioned earlier, his status as world heavyweight champion was not recognized by the National Police Gazette until he defeated Jake Kilrain in 1889. So if you look back at some of the historical clippings, research, things of that nature, you'll see up through that period, there was a beef between Sullivan and Fox. And one of the things, it wasn't solely this, but one of the things that was tied to it, of course, was the National Police Gazette. They didn't recognize Sullivan as the world heavyweight champion. And they noted that for the National Police Gazette, the world heavyweight championship had previously exchanged through bare knuckle contests under these rules where they were not gloves, because Sullivan, he was operating as a glove fighter full time. That's one thing to understand. When Sullivan he was trying to avoid trouble, he got in trouble for that Patty Ryan fight, and I have a video that dives into that. But he was operating as a glove fighter. He was never recognized by National Police Gazette after he defeated him, and therefore that's why John L. Sullivan ended up taking that fight with Jake Kilrain. If it weren't for the fact that the National Police Gazette wouldn't recognize him as the world heavyweight champion, John L. Sullivan, he would not have fought in a non-gloved competition against Jake Kilrain in 1889 to substantiate such. The only reason he did it is to get that recognition right there, because he was already in trouble with the law in the same area from previously in fighting Patty Ryan down there. And therefore, this is what made him, or this was the reason behind him actually taking this fight with Jake Kilrain. And after that, he was recognized as the world heavyweight champion. Now, as mentioned, Jake Kilrain, he was American, right? But he had defeated Jim Smith, who was a British fighter, and that was considered to be the world bare knuckle championship, heavyweight championship fight right there. So Kilrain came into the fight with he came into the fight with the belt, or he came into the fight being recognized as the world heavyweight championship in the bare knuckle world, or whatever it may be, somewhere in there. Now, did Sullivan fight? Joe asked, did Ryan fight, or did he fight Ryan bare knuckle? He did. He did fight Ryan bare knuckle. They fought multiple times. I can't remember the exact amount, but they fought both bare knuckle and they fought in gloved competition. The fight in 1881, I believe, or 82, it might have been 1882. I believe that was a bare knuckle contest where Ryan came in, and Ryan, I guess he was dealing with an ulcer or whatever. This was like a 3-rounder, and after Ryan and Sullivan fought, Sullivan did defeat him, but he still was not recognized as the world heavyweight champion in that contest, even though he did defeat Ryan, and it was bare knuckle, and they did compete under the glove rule or competition or whatever it may be. But that being said, from there, yeah, you had this period with Sullivan. By some, as I mentioned, some recognized Sullivan as the world heavyweight champion as far back as 1882, 1881, or whenever it was. But it wasn't fully recognized there as far as him being the world heavyweight champion. So I wanted to point that piece out. And of course, we had to look back on some of the video. I've documented in some videos, and I had to look back on it myself to tie up some roots or whatever, or tie some strings and things of that nature. But I'm giving it to you as I recall it here off top from just knowing about it, just from going through that process of researching it and everything. But that being said, yeah, there was an issue right there in between said recognition and such. And it had something to do with that particular period when Sullivan fought Ryan. And as you noted there, your question there, they did fight both gloved and bare knuckle, Joe. I will note they did fight. So their particular surrounding it and everything. But that, I guess it could be its own story in a sense, and maybe that should happen. Maybe I should talk about that. But I just want to throw that out there. So John L. Sullivan, and when we're talking about the color line, big picture, that opportunity there for him to take on CC Smith, that was one of the key factors in that was also one of the key factors in him not being back as the world heavyweight champion, right? So wanted to throw that one out there. And if you saw the actual or looking at the actual banner, then you have George Godfrey and Peter Jackson. Just wanted to throw them out there from a John L. Sullivan perspective. Now, George Godfrey, he was essentially of the era of Sullivan in a similar capacity to CC Smith. And in the case of Sullivan and George Godfrey, Sullivan and Godfrey were at one point in the ring, stripped to their trousers, ready to go, because it was one of those situations where Sullivan, he would tour across the country, or he'd be in different areas, primarily operating out of the Boston area. Then he had points where he'd operate out of the Madison Square Garden. But basically, he issued an open challenge, like anyone step in the ring will fight. But it just so happened to be on one of these particular instances, George Godfrey was there. They ended up in the ring, stripped to their trousers, as is documented, and then the police came in and stopped the fight. Now, we read some of what was presented there. Some say, or some feel that, hey, that was probably happily accepted there by John L. Sullivan in some sense. Now I've shared different things on the channel. That would have been an instance where Sullivan would have been taking on the best black heavyweight at that particular time, in this particular instance, and George Godfrey, who was a colored world heavyweight champion, I believe, at that particular time. Now, it didn't happen, right? And I don't know that George Godfrey would have defeated him. I don't know that CC Smith would have defeated him, actually. It could have been very well. If you look at it from a size perspective, I think that George Godfrey, he was smaller than Sullivan just from an overall size mass standpoint, but he was in top shape and he could go the distance. But Sullivan could too, especially when he was on his game. So, but that being said, I do think that it would have been tough for Godfrey to get that victory over Sullivan. I don't know what would have happened. But I think I've said in the past, I might have leaned a little bit towards Sullivan because he was going to be the bigger, stockier guy as far as throwing those punches offensively. In Godfrey, he could take a hell of a punch by virtue of him taking on Peter Jackson. And I think that showed such. But that being said, I don't know that Godfrey would have beat John L. Sullivan. Same with CC Smith. Now, CC Smith, size-wise, matched up pretty much nearly identical to John L. Sullivan when you think about peak John L. Sullivan. And that would have been an interesting one right there. I don't know if CC Smith would have won. I don't know if Sullivan would have won. It would have been interesting. I had to think about it a bit further. Both of them had the ability to win, I would say. And what I was mentioning, both of them were 16-0 or whatever. For Sullivan, all of his were via knockout. For CC Smith, all but two were, I believe, via knockout or something like that in his victories. All but two of his victories are via knockout. So he was, 16 victories, 14 knockouts, 16 knockouts for John L. Sullivan, right? So that would have made it interesting right there. And then I'll just mention, Jackson, Peter Jackson, because at the time, Peter Jackson was considered to be, by some, you could argue even many, the top heavyweight in the world at a particular period where he and Sullivan crossed over while Sullivan was the champion, especially after Sullivan had defeated Jake Kilrain. So if you look at 1892 when Sullivan lost to Corbett, Peter Jackson, by many, was regarded as the best heavyweight period in the world at that time. And if you look at his resume, or you look on BoxRec or Cyber Boxing Zone or whatever, he had the Australian title, he had the British Commonwealth title, and he had some other titles that he had in the mix as well. He had beat the Irish Giant Peter Jackson to pick up the Commonwealth title. He did it in Ireland. He had won the Commonwealth title, it was some title, and the Commonwealth title. He fought in Britain, just throughout Britain, and knocked off all of the top British heavyweights. He had already beat the top Australian heavyweights. He beat Irish Giant's Peter Marr, as mentioned. Excuse me. And he was here in the U.S. specifically to fight John L. Sullivan, and it did not happen. I explained this in a video. I'll try to share the link to the video there. And that's one that does get away from him. Or I would say out of all of them, this is probably the most damning one, because if you look at if you research Peter Jackson at that particular period with John L. Sullivan, there was no question that there were media people out there in the famous newspapers and all that stuff asking for that fight specifically. And Sullivan refused to fight him. Now, as Random Acoustic Thoughts had mentioned earlier on, there was John L. Sullivan was quoted later in life saying that the one time that it was brought to him, the issue of fighting Peter Marr, that he said he would do it if they would fight in the cellar or basement of some place so no people would be around, and that he offered him the opportunity to fight in this place or whatever, and that Peter didn't take it or whatnot. And for some, you could say, oh man, look, he had an opportunity, he didn't take it. This would have been just like them, nobody there to witness it, I guess, except for their handlers and stuff. On the other hand, you can look at it like, why would Peter Jackson take that fight when he's really trying to fight the guy who's considered to be the best heavyweight in the world at the time, outside of himself, with the title on the line, and what would have been a unification fight? And should the victor not gain any, or what is it saying, to the victor no spoils, or something like that? I forget the exact saying right there, but big picture, what I'm trying to say is, why would he take sort of this backroom deal just to appease John L. Sullivan when he had already knocked off all of the top heavyweights in the world outside of John L. Sullivan? He fought Jim Corbett, as I mentioned. Corbett came up, and that was a 61-round draw. There are different reportings as far as you've had some had it a draw. So you have some saying, Jackson got the better of it. You have some saying Corbett got the better of it. There were some injuries involved and all of that stuff. But big picture, 61 rounds. Think about that, 61-round draw. Corbett, we know what Corbett did to John L. Sullivan, albeit this was not the peak version of John L. Sullivan. That being said, surely if John L. Sullivan would have been in the ring with Peter Jackson anywhere between 1890 and 1892, then he would have been knocked out. Similar capacity to what Corbett did. And we know Corbett wasn't necessarily a big guy, big puncher, but Peter Jackson, you're talking about 6'2", 200 plus pounds. And from all indications, explosive, one of the top boxers. There were some who considered him to be the top boxer in the sport, regardless of weight class. And, you think about this in the 1890s at that particular period. They considered the late 1880s and then early 1890s. There were those that considered Peter Jackson to be the top boxer in the sport, regardless of weight classes. And he was a heavyweight right there. So that should tell you everything you need to know. You think about some of the guys who were in and around the sport during that particular period. So I just wanted to bring that piece of it. So those are probably those three. And really, realistically, the Peter Jackson, I would say that's probably the most damning one for Sullivan that didn't happen at that particular period in time. Just in my opinion, I think that's the most damning one for him. But even if you look at Sullivan outside of just not facing those guys, let's just say we take the black fighter out of the equation. He didn't fight others. He didn't fight during that period, which I highlighted in my video. He didn't fight Paddy Ryan, who outside of Peter Jackson was the best Australian heavyweight in the world at that particular time. And you could say he was the best heavyweight outside of Peter Jackson and John L. Sullivan for a period there. So you had him, you had other guys where it kind of could have, Sullivan could have potentially fought them. That's not necessarily, though, where things would have had to shape up well, like Bill Farnan, who was one of the top Australian boxers, the guy who Peter Jackson early in his career, he lost twice, I believe it was, to Bill Farnan. And that was a learning lesson for Peter Jackson. Peter Jackson trained by Foley, William Foley. I think it's William Foley. Shout out to Historical Boxing Society. He did something on him. So Foley was behind a lot of the top fighters out of Australia. But Peter Jackson, he didn't start out as the fighter that he will become. It's just that at that particular period, I think he was the best heavyweight in the world. And there were many that recognized it, even media. And I can link specific articles and things to even show you such in the chatter and all of that around Sullivan fighting Jackson. But I'll leave it there, Random, before we move on to the next guy.
Yeah. I mean, for Jeffries, well, for Fitz, obviously, there's some good matchups, but Jeffries, like Fitz and Bob Armstrong would have been a really good one. So Armstrong's a big fella. Fitz wasn't overly large. He just hit like a truck. He was like a wiry frame, but Armstrong was big, especially later in his career and even after his career when he was a trainer. He was a big fella. Mm-hmm. That would have been a good fight. But yeah, we got Jeffries. Denver Ed Martin wanted to fight him when he held, well, not just when he held the Color Championship, but that as well. Mm-hmm. Jack Johnson, Sam McVeigh, they were all calling for Jeffries' fight. So was Barbados Walcott, the welterweight champion.
Oh, he
wanted to, well, even before he was welterweight champion, Barbados Walcott wanted all the smoke, man. He had an open weight challenge. He was 5'1.5". He's up with a giant chest, and he was just like, I'll fight at any weight. And he knew how to weaponize his build, and he hit like just a monster. So, that would be the extreme example. That's kind of a little freak show, but thing is, Barbados Walcott didn't just issue challenges. He did fight heavyweights. Comical size differences, but yeah, Jeffries, of those matchups, I would love to have seen Jeffries, Jack Johnson, like around 1903, 1904, maybe even 1905. But like by 1905, Jeffries wasn't very active. So 1904 was his last fight. So maybe like 1903, when Johnson wasn't at his full size yet. He was pretty lean then, but he had all his cleverness and vast experience. And like Johnson's thing was he was too clever for the big guys often, and he's too good at using his size for the little guys. So that would be a lot of the equation in during his career, especially when he was the champion, and then Langford was his main contender most of that time, because Langford would be giving up size, but Langford actually hit harder than Johnson, and by then had more ring experience than Johnson across multiple weights. So that was part of the equation. But Johnson was really good at using his size as well as very clever. But he wouldn't have been the harder hitter, even though he's the bigger man. So there's some strange equations out there. But like you'd mentioned, like the size difference, like with Godfrey and Sullivan, but like Charlie Mitchell wasn't that big of a guy. And he gave Sullivan a real good fight. And I think it was 1888, Chantilly in France. And I remember that because I saw after Joe Jeanette and Sam McVeigh had their second fight of 1909, the 49 rounder, the French paper was saying, I think it was the French paper, or maybe it was the ref, but someone was saying that it was the greatest fight seen in France since Charlie Mitchell and John L. Sullivan in 1888 in Chantilly. So,
hey, good one right there, Random. Now you have varying things. Some think that Charlie Mitchell practically ran the entire fight. It did end up being a draw, agreed upon draw by the teams or whatever. But that being said, it was a good one right there. And Charlie Mitchell, he was about 160 pounds, somewhere around 160 something pounds at that particular time. Now he was considered a heavyweight, but he was like a heavyweight in similar vein to some of the past, especially crossing over that London prize ring world, bare knuckle world, where they weren't necessarily what we know to be with the 200 pounders and such. But Mitchell, he would more so be a middleweight, kind of even maybe getting up to light heavyweight in that range. But he was, I believe he was 160 and something in that 160 something pounds in that contest in France. Now, I believe it was under London prize ring rules. And in London prize ring rules, if a knockdown occurred, that was considered to be the end of the round. I know it went for, I believe, I want to say around 3 hours or somewhere in there, between 2 and 3 hours, I want to say. And there were reports that there were points in which Mitchell was intentionally dropping to end the round or whatnot, but it was essentially the first time. Really, it was a kind of blemish for Sullivan, just from an overall standpoint, just considering how it actually went down, and Mitchell being the smaller guy and Sullivan not being able to essentially knock him out, because he was known to knock a lot of his opponents out, the majority of them, as a matter of fact. Shout out to Strength and Honor, but he mentioned he had about 70 KOs or whatever. But yeah, Sullivan, he was known to knock pretty much the majority of his opponents out. So that was something that was brought up there. But you're right, Mitchell was one they reported on. So it's very interesting. And there's only a select few that got to see that fight. And it ended up raining and all of that stuff. And I think it got muddy and all of that because it was outside. He was outside, and it wasn't the traditional ring as we know it. They were on good old-fashioned dirt, mud, and they ended up calling it. Just wanted to note that right there with Charlie Mitchell. Damn good fighter, though.
Yo, Josh, with you saying that, it's just occurred to me, maybe what the press meant was the greatest contest, as in the longest.
Oh, yeah?
Because that went for hours, and that Jeanette McVeigh went, so that would make sense in that context. Even if the other one wasn't a good fight, they're like the greatest contest. They literally just fought for hours.
Yeah.
Especially in the days when not everyone gets to see the fights. So they're reporting on the results and so fighting for hours, like you can, the imagination kicks in. So maybe that's what was being referred to.
Yeah, probably. And we know that certainly Jeanette McVeigh, that was very different when that was a very, very brutal affair right there. And if you look at it from that standpoint, and I think we've talked about this, Random, in terms of the greatest fights in history. Like if you look at it in modern times, that one won't get mentioned. But if you were to just look back in history in general, and it's a tough thing to say, but man, you'd be hard pressed to find a greater fight than that, just knowing what we know about what transpired on that evening.
Yeah, the counts vary, but they really went to battle in the extreme. And they had 3 fights that year, which is
insane. That one after that one was like 2 weeks or something, right?
McVeigh won the first fight, 20 rounder, and then Jeanette won the 49 rounder, and then I think they had a 30-round draw.
And that was like 2 weeks later or something like that, or less than 2 weeks.
I don't actually remember when it was, but they also had other fights that year. That wasn't, they fought 99 rounds against each other, but they also had other fights.
And folks, and I just want to say, random folks, I have the Sam McVeigh video on the channel where I dive into that, and I don't think I even do it enough justice, because if you go by the actual round by round, I only included some aspects of the round by round, but they have round by round accounts of this contest. It is absolutely one of the most brutal things you could read in terms of an actual boxing contest. Just think about being administered oxygen in between rounds, the amount of blood loss. Jeanette was knocked down, I want to say 27 times or something crazy like that. And another, how many ever for McVeigh? It's just like a brutal affair. And check out that video on the channel for Sam McVeigh. On Sam McVeigh, because I touch on it, but like I said, I don't think it even does its true justice.
Yeah, these are great heavyweights, and because of the title structure, the strength of their resume and the level of competition isn't fully expressed in title fights, colored or otherwise. They just had a really rich schedule, and they're fighting each other and there's these amazing battles that happen. So like even though like a time like during Johnson's reign, he became less active, but they didn't. They were fighting tons of fights. So viewing boxing history and including the colored title lineage, it really does fill out what was happening with titles because if you ignore them, as some people do, stuff can look pretty stagnant, right? Like, okay, Sullivan, oh, Corbett barely fights for the title when he's the champ. And but that's not a gap where nothing happened. That's just, when was Corbett? 1892? So Peter Jackson renounced his claim. Bob Armstrong won the colored claim in 1896. Fitz beat Corbett in 1897. Frank Charles won the colored claim in 1898. George Byers got him off it that same year. Jeffries beat Fitz in 1899. Frank Charles got the colored title again in 1899. Denver Ed Martin in 1902. Jack Johnson in 1903. Yeah. And then Jeffries retires in 1905. That's different than just, oh, Sullivan, Corbett, Fitz, Jeffries. There's a big difference. And so these championships, regardless of the relative esteem they were held in, they both should be recognized properly. And sometimes the claims are muddy, but that's life.
Hey, Random, in your research, just because it came up here, it was talking about, because Poppy Chu mentioned, see y'all about to maybe dive into the history of steroids and boxing. I wonder if the boxers were taking enhancers back in the day. And Joe mentioned they took cocaine. I know cocaine was around back in the day and all this stuff. What do you have any recollect on anything surrounding like cocaine or I guess that potential type of drug? And
no, I haven't encountered it.
Now, they were in some brutal contests, as we know, where just like they were pushing the human body far beyond the limits of what you would see today, or you would get thrown in jail today for some of these fights that they were having back then. So,
or even having a little bit of a drink.
I know that there was whiskey and things of that nature used in the corners and all that stuff, just to get them, keep them going out there for these long, drawn out contests that were going hours and such.
Yeah, but I haven't personally encountered reports of people using cocaine, but that's not to say it didn't happen. It's not something I've.
Yeah.
But as far as like stimulants, well, Langford at times in his career, like there was a time when he puffing those cigars in the corner.
Oh yeah.
And probably had a drink, maybe a little drink before the fight. I'm sure plenty of guys, I don't doubt that these things have happened, but I don't know. It's not really my area of study. It's not something I've come across.
And it's tough, certainly because the sport, if we think about it compared to now and back then, the differences there. And then, it was borderline barbaric in many instances back then. So I wouldn't doubt that, you had to do certain things to keep certain people wired to be able to withstand. And it, maybe not all of the fights, but you have, I think the longest fight ever is like 7 hours and something. And you just think about that. It wasn't just a outlier type of occurrence. It was a routine thing that was happening on a regular basis in terms of some of the fights back then, where it was nothing to see a 2 or 3 round fight. And those are listed as some of the greatest that the sport has seen. In some instances, Danny Needham and Tommy Ryan, they went for some crazy amount of hours that I can't recall right now, but it is in a video on that on the channel or whatever. But the amount of hours is ridiculous. And you think about it, and this is not just under, and I'm talking about under Marcus of Queensberry rules, where it's 3-minute rounds with that 1 minute rest. Just think about that. You're going for 2, 3, 4, whatever hours, but oftentimes back then you had a lot of unlimited fights. So people weren't leaving until they saw one fighter go down, and they didn't care what it took to get that fighter down.
Yeah. There's a lot of different versions going all the way back, versions of the rules, versions of how title claims function.
Yeah.
It's like it's the sports legacy is so rich. There's just so many versions of the setup and how things will come about. Sometimes at the same time, depending on region or country. So it's hard. It can be a challenge to compare it all. I just think
Yeah.
it's important to recognize it all.
Oh yes.
And then the color line, coming back to the color line, you mentioned Tommy Ryan. The
Oh
big
yeah.
fight for him was Barbados Walcott, who some said that Ryan went up to middleweight to get out of being called out all the time by Barbados Walcott. It didn't stop anything. Barbados Walcott was calling a lot of guys out, even heavyweights. So he didn't have a problem calling out the middleweight, but Ryan drew some criticism for drawing the color line. And even saying he would fight him and then drawing the color line anyway.
Yeah.
After Walcott won another fight, called him out. There was money involved, and he drew the line. That happened. Another one that was up on your thing was Sam Langford and George Gardner. There was a club in Chelsea, Massachusetts, Boston area that was trying to put that match together. Gardner famously lost the light heavyweight title to Bob Fitzsimmons in 1903, where Fitz became a man who attained 3 different weight class championships. But in 1905, the club wanted to get George Gardner in there with Langford, and Gardner drew the color line. Even though Gardner had fought great black fighters, he just drew a special line. The papers didn't let him get away with it, but he just didn't want to know. So that's another version of the color line where it's like extremely selective, and that wasn't even for a title. He wasn't champion anymore, and Langford wasn't a big guy, but that, in 1905, in Christmas Day, Langford fought Joe Jeanette in his first heavyweight fight. And so Gardner would have been in that range between then and like early to mid 1906. They could have fought. Gardner would have had a size advantage. He was a good fighter, but he just didn't want to know. Same with Tom Ryan and Joe Walcott. And Tom Ryan's a great fighter himself, but he didn't want that one. So I think that's. And actually, shout out to like the potential James J. Jeffries and Sam McVeigh fight, because when Jeffries was getting toward the end of his title reign, McVeigh didn't have a ton of experience, but he was a knockout guy, and he was a tank. He was already 200 plus pounds when he started in the game. So Jeffries being 200 plus, he was a little more heavy set by then. He wasn't quite his former lean self, but Jeffries was a real unit, and so was McVeigh, even if he would have been a little bit lighter. So that would have been a good fight. McVeigh was physically formidable. And just because Jack Johnson was able to beat McVeigh in 1903 doesn't mean Jeffries necessarily could have.
Oh yeah, true.
Because Johnson was the cleverer fighter. Jeffries wasn't a dumb fighter, but Johnson was famously clever. So he was able to handle McVeigh's raw intensity, but not necessarily raw, but a 2-hand punching knockout threat. So that would have been a good fight too.
Yeah. Hey, and I know we've talked about thoughts on sort of, so it's interesting, especially when you factor in the timing. So when you see Jeffries there, I'll remind you, people that are new to it at least. You see Jeffries there. Jeffries, he fought black fighters. With that being said, he drew the color line for the title. So when you see this right here, this is at the potential of them fighting for the world heavyweight title. And I've noted it previously. If you look at my Denver Ed Martin video on the channel, but at one point, Denver Ed Martin was the top black heavyweight. He was a colored world heavyweight champion, and he's an outstanding boxer just from a skill set standpoint, very clever. And of course, he was working with some of the other boxers in and around that era, at least. And Jeffries had noted that he would fight Denver Ed Martin, and he viewed Denver Ed Martin as the top guy out there for him to defend his title against. And it would have been the first fight between the colored world heavyweight champion and the world heavyweight champion. And then something changed over the course of that where he drew the color line. Now, of course, as I've noted before, I'm sure that there were some who got into his ear and he changed his stance, but his stance was not always that he would not fight a fighter of color for the title, because he was going to defend his title against Denver Ed Martin. And I can show you the specific quotes where he's saying such, but he did change that tune and took a harsher tone towards actually fighting a black fighter, especially when it came to Jack Johnson, who would usurp Denver Ed Martin shortly thereafter. So the issue with Denver Ed Martin is that he had a he had a short stint there when he was just on top of his game and probably outside of Jeffries, if not the top, certainly one of the top 2 or 3 heavyweights there in the world. But once he left, I guess you can say, this prime, and you know how it is. Some fighters have a shorter prime, which they're on top of their game, which they're at the peak of everything that they can do. Then from the understanding, from how they absorb and take shots. But he was the guy at one particular point, but that was derailed, of course, by Jack Johnson. Then eventually Sam McVay. Denver Ed Martin did beat Sam McVay, folks, just so you know. So he was a top flight type of guy there. But I wanted to note that because Random did mention that Jim Jeffries, yeah, he did end up drawing the color line, and he previously didn't. So that's an interesting thing right there. And we hear the discussions there, Random, of like, oh, how much money can you make with this black fighter taking on this white fighter, or should you, if the white fighter versus white fighter? But there are countless articles and accounts where you can see that from a fan standpoint, the fans, these same individuals who would have been white individuals, you name it, they were asking for these fights where it would be the white heavyweight champion taking on the colored world heavyweight champion. You know, the fans were asking for it. We have accounts of that. We even have media personnel, journalists, whatever it is, that were asking and clamoring for the same thing. So that makes it interesting.
Yeah, and the patrons, they want to bet on it.
Yeah.
Come on, man. It's fight sport. Not everyone bets, but like that is a major component. It's a thrill. They want their thrill. They want to, even if they're just betting on what they'll read in the newspaper because they don't live in the country or they can't get to the fight, can't afford it, whatever. But yeah, man, people want the fights.
They do.
And that's so. And as far as who would have won some of these matchups, we don't know. That's why we want to see the fights. You can't assume what's going to happen because the way people line up or certain decisions that are made that are irreversibly damaging to someone's cause, say like Joshua rocking Ruiz, but then trying to come in close and overthrowing his hooks instead of getting out of range, just keep him at the end of his range and just blast him out. Just a subtle mistake, got clocked, couldn't recover.
Yeah.
You know, you never know what's going to happen. You know, Lennox Lewis didn't go undefeated. You know, people have shock results. It does happen.
Oh, yeah.
They don't always even get those back sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry to cut you off there, Ren, but we talked about that. You noted, like, say Johnson and Jeffries would have fought in 1903. I've said that that's a very interesting one. I don't know who would have won. I could see Jeffries being the favorite there, and I could see a means for me leaning towards Jeffries getting the victory there. Would it have happened? I don't know, but there was a way for Johnson to win as well, so it's very interesting, you know?
Yeah, and he had a good amount, still had some weight on him at that point. Johnson wasn't up at that 200-pound plus size yet. So, yeah, Jeffries, that was part of why he was considered the top guy, even with the rival lineage. Because he was a big fella, big bone, too. And so that's always a factor. Like, can the size be overcome? That was the factor with Langford and Johnson. Although in that case, Johnson wasn't a harder hitter than Jeffries.
Yeah,
he was a better puncher, but he wasn't a harder hitter. Whereas Langford was actually a harder hitter than Johnson, which is crazy to think about with the pounds difference in the size. Gosh.
Yeah, and that's another one we've talked about there, Random, in terms of, as a matter of fact, I feel like we had a discussion on it. I can't remember for sure if we had a full discussion on that topic specifically, but we had a discussion on Langford versus Johnson too. And if we haven't, I'll have to look back. Maybe we can do something like that again there, Langford. And I'm pretty sure we were on opposite ends because I still leaned Jack Johnson and you were with Langford. But that being said, I understand that Sam Langford could have very well won that fight if they would have fought that second time. But one of the things is I think some people think that it was just automatic that Langford was going to win. We don't know for certain that he was going to win. In likelihood, he would have got that victory just given where Langford was at that particular time. But that being said, it's not like Jack Johnson was just going to go in there and roll over. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and the way people in the press wrote, they were very critical. Like they kept a high bar. So the way the press would write about it, they weren't sure either. And same with these other matchups. Like even when there was an advantage that now and with hindsight we can see clearly, doesn't mean in the lead up there weren't people who thought maybe a certain fighter had the solution. Like when Stanley Ketchel got the fight with Jack Johnson in 1909, it's like Ketchel was way smaller. He didn't have a lot of finesse. He was a hard hitter for a middleweight, of course, but fighting a heavyweight and without who had all the finesse, we can see now that was a terrible matchup for him. But at the time, they were thrilled for that fight. Especially as, again, not everyone's going to these fights in person. So they're reading about abilities, they're weighing relative to fighters they have seen or do know about. And so like after Johnson had beaten Tommy Burns, the biggest fight to him by the purse offers was a rematch with Tommy Burns. It was a Stanley Ketchel fight and it was a Sam Langford fight. And those are his biggest offers.
Oh, yeah.
So it's ironic that he would say there's no money in it, or he would imply that at times when it suited him. But that's it. So you think about that. So you've got you just have this undisputed champ. I mean, they didn't talk about it that way because a lot of the white writers just considered that one as the real championship and the colored title to be like a second heavyweight division, the other division, which is why it gets really weird piecing it all together. But yeah, so you have Johnson, but his biggest fights, Tommy Burns had fought as a middleweight.
Oh yeah, that's true.
And Langford was still a middleweight or could still make the middleweight limit. And Ketchel was outgrowing middleweight, but he claimed he could still make the middleweight limit. So, it's just interesting. Those are the big money fights. And they weren't booking them because they wanted to see a freak show. They're booking them because by the math of the day, they thought that the speed of Langford and Ketchel might be the answer to Johnson because he was too fast and clever for the big guys.
Yeah.
Now, Jeffries was a different subject because Jeffries wasn't a stupid guy either, and he was well-trained. Tommy Ryan and other great fighters really gave him a lot of pointers. He'd proven himself. And
whole different animal to deal with that
and sort of huge.
Size and athleticism.
Right, but in general, Johnson was too good for the big guys. So other guys who were on the larger side for the day, Al Kaufman, guys like that, he could handle these dudes easily. Fireman Jim Flynn was smaller than him, but he handled him with ease.
Yeah.
But the difference with the Langford matchup is that Langford had more experience than any of these guys. He'd also fought faster fighters than any of them had because he had started at lightweight. He'd started in the 135-pound class and as an amateur, and then 133 as a pro. So, these 200-pound guys, Langford actually liked fighting bigger guys. They were slower. He had a great chin. He had good technique, great counters. So for him, the equation actually worked pretty good when he was giving up some size. So what we think of as a disadvantage, certain fighters can turn around. Joe Walcott was really good at heavyweight, even though he was a tiny little guy. He wasn't even 150. If he wasn't training down, he was the champ at 142. No, very few men wanted to fight him as welterweights. That's where they had, they have their white claims and things. Yeah. But they, because those are still big fights. You say, it's the white championship, and then it's two big names. People come, people buy the tickets, they bet on the fight. So it's like these claims, they're to some degree, just like today, they're of convenience. They don't have an inherent worth.
Mm-hmm.
They really don't. Even like we talk about lineal. By the time Jeffries came back, he'd been out of the ring. His last fight was what? Jack Monroe. The guy had gotten a little better of him as an amateur in 2004. And he came back in 1910, the middle of 1910. So yeah, now technically he's the lineal champ and he's fight Johnson. He's a shell of his former self.
Right.
He got all fat and he had to lose a ton of weight. Even though he got in good shape for his age, he wasn't in good shape to fight Jack Johnson.
Right. He had to drop 100 over 100 pounds. So that's pretty much what the focus of his camp and everything was, to get down to be able to even fight.
I've seen that reference, but I haven't seen in the writing about that fight. I don't remember seeing someone specifically at the time saying that he lost that much weight.
Yeah. I've heard it.
I don't know how out of shape, but I have heard people say it a lot, but I haven't actually seen it in my research. Now, that is not my specific narrow area of research, but it does swirl around what I'm looking at.
Yeah, I had to look into it further. But yeah, I know of it being referenced over 100 pounds. But that being said, yeah, I had to look into it. I may have some stuff that is out there. I'm not even sure. I'll have to look back. But yeah, that's a good one. And then, of course, we do have visual reference because one of the things that Jeffries was doing he was officiating during his retirement period. So there's some footage out there of him officiating. Matter of fact, he was officiating the Philadelphia Jack O'Brien and Tommy Burns. I think it's the second fight.
Interesting.
I believe it's that one in the footage. He's the official there because Jeffries had an arena. I want to say it was out in California. I could be wrong, but I know he had his own. Well, they call it an arena, but it wasn't like covered or anything. Not an arena in the sense of a covered facility, but he had a location where he had stands and all that stuff. People could come and they could watch fights. I can't remember if it happened there specifically, but that being said, Jeffries was officiating in the aftermath. I'm going to look real quick on that footage right there because I'm pretty sure he was in there, Random.
But yeah, I've seen some pictures in the papers of him refereeing. I even saw pictures of one fight where he wasn't the ref, but what they did is they cut out and pasted it in and then drew to make the gaps to where he was the ref in the fight, even though he hadn't reffed the fight. He was that kind of star. They were like, this is what it would have looked like if Jeffries was refereeing this fight. It was the fight out in California I saw in the paper. I thought that was hilarious. That's when you know you're a star. There's like fantasy referee cameo from Jeff. That's wild.
Yeah, so he is in there. Look, I'm about to drop this one in here in the chat, folks, to check it out for yourself. If you want to check it out. But Jeffries, if you look at him in this video, he does look like he's probably about 300 pounds or more. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and he's big boned. He had a big frame. He could carry the weight in theory. I just wanted to point out, note that I haven't personally seen in the clippings I have seen in that drama.
How he was? I would say he looked like he's probably closer to 300 pounds. I would say, looking at him in there.
Yeah, the stakes of that fight were unbelievable, Johnson Jeffries, because the thing was when he retired, even before he retired, he said when he was drawing the color line, he had said he wouldn't give a black man a title shot. The only way you could see him fighting for the title against a black man is if somehow a black guy ended up with the title and he was coming back to take it back for the white man, which what he ended up trying to do. Now immediately. But like the press wouldn't let it go. So like Jeffries was held in such high esteem again, because, it's not the TV things. You don't see him on TV and be like, dang, Jeff, you getting big over there, dude. You don't even look like yourself. So people didn't have today's calibration about how easily you can get way out of shape. So like people still really thought he could do it all those years later.
Yeah, right.
And the biggest thing that could have happened, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned for Johnson, the biggest fight for him, of course, when he won the title, when he took Tommy Burns part of the championship, was the Jeffries fight. Now, Jeffries initially said he wasn't coming back. Then he changed his tune, money talks. But
a lot of money being thrown at you.
He said he wouldn't fight. He wasn't coming back. But he was probably just starting to get in shape because he knew it was this huge fight. It wasn't going to go away. Even though it had been years, the end of 1908, and he retired officially. His last fight was in 2004. But again, just like with Fury took some time off, right?
Yep.
And you can make an argument that lineal thing he's not the same guy when he comes back after all that.
Yeah, and
but people still count it. So
soon, in like May or something, April.
Say that again.
He's about to come back again here in May or April, but that's another story there. Fury, that is.
Right. But so the whole idea of the lineal, the Jeffries Johnson fight was a huge deal, huge money fight, right? Gigantic cultural event. Even when Jeffries announced his return, he went on a tour, like a just I'm back tour, meeting people and getting advice from fighters and just being greeted like he was a real hero.
Mhm.
So when he,
Mhm.
you know, it was that kind of a big deal. It was like a sensational event, but it wasn't the hardest matchup for Johnson.
Oh yeah,
It just wasn't.
yeah. Very interesting. Shout out to my man Dan, the man, Bookham Dan. I thought it said Broken Dan here earlier there, Dan. Shout out to Dan. Yeah, it was a tough task there. Yeah, we know that. Yeah, you dropping all of that weight coming back in prime. Dan says in prime, Jeffrey would destroy Johnson. Ask Mike Tyson, who knows 100 times more than any of us. Hey, interesting, Dan. I don't know. Interesting. I will say that's certainly an opinion right there, Dan. Uh, I've said that I don't know who would have won had they fought in 1903, but I could argue leaning Jeffries in some capacity. That being said, I don't know there, Dan. It would be interesting. I don't know if he would destroy him. I don't know that he would destroy him. I think it would be an interesting contest there for sure. And I think if you take like Johnson at his best versus Jeffries at his best, man, that's a 50-50 matchup, depending on the circumstances, at least.
Yeah, it's worth noting like Jeffries was good at getting in while protected. He didn't just have a good chin; he had a nice shell. He was kind of hard to get in there. Use that arm extended, like Tommy Ryan helped hook him up with that technique. But Johnson was an easy guy to get inside on or to land on. He was famously not so, and that got more
Yeah,
and more pronounced as his career went on. So there is a point at which Johnson maybe has less experience and his size hasn't. The difference
yeah,
is enough that Jeffries has an advantage in the fight, but that doesn't mean he can get in and land. Even if he can bully him around, he can still get picked apart on points. So I think it's a good matchup, but I think as time went on, it's just Johnson was gaining in size and experience and comfortable, in his larger frame, larger size, and
yeah,
it was getting further. And by the time they actually fought in 1910, forget about it.
yeah. Say 1908, when he won the title. What 1908, right? Say that version
December
of Johnson.
1908. Yeah.
So that version of Johnson against Jeffries at his peak. Yeah, that's an interesting one right there.
Yeah, Jeffries had started training in '07, and then right after, like, say instead of the Langford Johnson booking for May of 1909, say that was Johnson Jeffries,
Oh
with
yeah,
that much time out of the ring. But if he had started that
that
much
would have been
sooner,
slightly
maybe
easier.
it would have been a little closer. But I just think it was that Jeffries may not have been clever enough to use his physical advantages enough.
So yeah, and that's what makes it interesting. It makes it tough for me because I do think that the 1903 of three version of Johnson wasn't a finished product, of course. Um, and you could argue that so like 1903 version of Jeffries, that was him at his best, or just maybe clear near his best in terms of maybe decelerating from his best or whatever. So that makes it interesting right there. That was not the best version of Johnson, so that would come a little bit later. So it would have depended on how things transpired with Jeffries. I'll note that Jeffries, he was dealing with, I don't know if it might have been a back issue that had been one of the things that had been bothering him over the course of 1904, maybe even into 1903 or something like that. So that's what makes it super tough right there. It's just the versions of each fighter right there, because that was certainly not a complete Johnson around 1903, 1904 time frame,
Interesting point. But I think, the Jeffries Johnson, some of it was just the sheer size of Jeffries and the size of his, his myth, is like his legend is so like, but we've seen that too when Fury was at or near the top, and people saying, Usyk, get out of here, man. He's too small. He just can't handle the size. Just can't handle the size. And we saw the fights.
Yeah, we saw what happened, right?
Can't handle the size, and that's not the only time that's happened where you go, oh, wait a minute, he could. because of the way they lined up. So,
It's
although
certainly a factor, not the factor. It can be depending on the circumstance, but when you gotta, but yeah,
uh, that's a
that's
good
not.
question from Joe right there. Floyd Patterson beat
Yeah,
Johnson.
yeah, I was gonna mention that one there. What do you
I
think there?
love that
Of course,
matchup.
two very different styles. But
I
yeah,
like
what do you
his.
think?
I actually like his chances specifically because of the style.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Although Johnson, if he roughed it up, might be able to turn it into an advantage. But if they fought more of a clean style, Patterson
Yeah,
had fast enough hands. He wasn't
I
particularly
think you can
large,
certainly outpoint him for sure.
but he was a guy who could really throw in those swimming hooks when he swims up into the hook and then either to the body or the head or alternating him. That's pretty dangerous. He might
You had that
do
peekaboo
better than
stick.
other bigger guys. Patterson had some real speed in the hands and a good style, so maybe he would improve on other people's results. I think there are worse matchups for Patterson than Johnson specifically because of the hand
Yeah,
speed. And he could
yeah,
hit too. Patterson hit hard. He was his chin relative to the heavyweight division was more of the question. Chin and recovery. It wasn't about hand speed or hard hitting. He was a. You can listen to the fight coverage of the day, the way they talk about his power. Especially after he got the title back. That
yeah.
left hook. Forget
And
about it.
Johnson wasn't that type of guy who would go in and just blitz him in the capacity that like Sonny Liston did, for instance. Just going in just heavy shots, just blitzing Floyd Patterson in that way. So Johnson wasn't that guy stylistically, which is another aspect of it.
Yeah, and if we're talking like 200 plus pounds, Johnson, see, like Liston, as good as he was, long arms, big fists, he might have a difficult time with Johnson. Not that he couldn't land on him. I mean, he was a tank, right? But I think he might have a tougher time just because of the way the styles line up. Because Johnson could really mess with people. You know how to pull your arms and make it really uncomfortable. He wasn't, this is the days when most of this isn't filmed at all. So, if you're on the blind side of the ref, you get a good yank in, this and that. Johnson knew all that stuff. So as far as some of these larger, scarier guys, if you look at their fight styles, sometimes they might not be able to do what we see them doing to other people. Say, take like George Foreman, great fighter, right? See what he's doing to Frazier? Frazier's style, the bobbing style, is not working for him because when he does catch him, it's too much power.
And he just like.
But if you look at some of his fights, Foreman overthrows his punches locks. He's throwing really wide swings, right? And there are fighters who could punish that throughout history. Johnson is one of those guys. Now, Johnson would be the smaller man, and obviously that's some crazy power. But if you're talking about someone who can punish people who are a little wild, Jack Johnson was that guy. And so I think some of these matchups for him, he actually lines up pretty good with some of the large guys.
Yeah.
The scary guys, because he's smarter than they are. He's cooler headed, and he's enjoying himself in there. He's not getting the same amount of anger, adrenaline dumps, and all that stuff. Cool as a cucumber. Or when he did get a little flustered after Ketchel knocked him down, he just smashed him instantly.
So that's a dynamic there, Random. So, and I know we've talked about it before. As a matter of fact, you pointed it out, I'm sure, before, in terms of the footage we have of Johnson. Johnson is footage of him, I believe, when he had the title, right? That's all the footage, right? Just title related footage, right? We don't have like earlier footage of Johnson, and therefore the version of Johnson we do see in a lot of that footage and all of that stuff is a guy who, if it's a slower paced fight, of course, that's his strong suit right there, and he's gonna, get in there, kind of just wear you down. He's not gonna overextend himself throwing any unnecessary punches. If it seems like you're getting an opportunity to try and get something in, he's gonna tie you up and he's gonna stop you from being able to do anything. Then he might put you off there, then go to the same thing. He'll work around with you a little bit. Then as soon as you try to get some offense off, he's gonna grab you, sort of nullify that. Now I know what I've read. I'm sure what you've read as well. Yeah, there are Johnson. He had some other iterations of himself as a fighter, but what we have on footage is this sort of version that I was describing, you know, and it would be interesting, you know, to have seen him. This is where I think we would have most benefited from seeing him against a guy like Sam Langford if he would have fought Langford, because we've seen Langford, we've seen how Langford stalks and cuts off the ring. So I think it would have forced us to see a version of Johnson that was probably at the peak of his senses in terms of, okay, I know what's in front of me, so I'm gonna have to operate a little bit differently. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, definitely Langford Johnson, especially because Langford was a guy that you didn't want to just come and bang out with.
Right.
We see it in some of the footage that survived of Langford. You know, Jim Flynn was particularly hard nosed, and he was a little bigger than Langford rather than getting schooled by Johnson was bigger than him. But Flynn got inside. Langford took all that stuff, landed some vicious stuff inside. But we see in like the Bill Lang footage
Yeah.
where Lang tries to mix it up. Langford's just right there banging. He's like, I can take anything you can throw from this range, and I have these long arms, so we have the same reach, and I hit harder because he's got a bigger chest and shoulders than these heavyweights, even though he can still train down to middleweight or later when he's a light heavyweight. You know, he's got a bigger chest and upper body, not his head necessarily, but his upper body, the musculature and the frame is broader than the other heavyweights. So even like Johnson's a bigger man, but that doesn't mean Johnson has like a broader torso. Langford was kind of freaky like that. So, and as he grew through light heavyweight into heavyweight, he just kept getting. So like you see late career photos of him, his arms are gigantic. It's cartoonish. You know, because he's got a little extra weight, but you can see just like absolute pistons, the ramrod puncher, you know, like, so that definitely changes the equation, because when Tommy Burns fought Jack Johnson, he just didn't have the same effect. Couldn't get in easily, got schooled. His size he couldn't compensate for the size, but Langford hit so hard that he had compensating power, just like Rocky. If you take away Rocky's phenomenal power, he's going to struggle, because guys are going to be, there's not going to be the same risk of getting hit by something flush that he carried with him. And that's a danger that makes people take account for. You don't fight him the same way you fight other guys. Langford was like that. Dempsey was like that at a point in his career.
Yeah.
Like the big guys had struggled with him. Fred Fulton and Willard, they didn't just struggle, they got demolished.
Yeah, right.
Because speed and power and his technique, they lined up real bad.
Yeah, he destroyed those cats. Those bigger guys, he would absolutely freaking destroy them. Real quick, Dan mentioned Johnson longest boxing career in history, fought Jeanette in the 60s. In 60s exhibition, of course, but in his 60s, that was the case. But you got Jim Mace who was out there. Jim Mace who was out there. Then you have Professor Mike Donovan. There's a Professor Mike Donovan. Apparently Professor Mike Donovan and Jim Mace had a fight where they were in their 60s as well. I know you know of this one, Dan. You've mentioned it before as well. So they were up there as well. They might be the oldest, or one of the oldest for sure. They're just thinking about it from a legitimacy standpoint. Professor Mike Donovan and Jim Mace. I want to say, I can't remember who was older. Maybe Mace had a year or so, somewhere around there though. But I know you recall them there, Dan. Oh yeah, so Dan mentioned Jim Mace fought at the age of 78. Yeah, that's insane right there. But Mace, he's of that old school lineage, going back to the bare knuckle style. And he's like, and I was mentioning earlier, I had made the comment of Charlie Mitchell being built a particular type of way, sort of the vein of a Jim Mace, who was a guy who was really kind of middleweight, and then ultimately he would end up fighting heavyweights and became heavyweight champion. He was a middleweight champion in the bare knuckle world and heavyweight champion, but he's not like a huge guy, just a guy that was, built for, taking out these bigger opponents or whatnot. And in the case of Mace, of course, his stuff was built on that rugged fighting style, his power, and his ability to take out his opponents and all of that stuff. So true legend of the sport right there for sure.
Yeah, man. And you know, with no gloves or alternately smaller gloves, you can be undersized and still crack a good punch. And that's something to always keep in mind where you go, this guy's too small. Well, yeah, if you put him in some big old, whatever, 12-ounce gloves, but if he's in 4-ounce gloves and he's giving up 30 pounds, a punch is a punch. Fist is bigger than a chin, you know what I mean? With only a few exceptions, you know, it's like, so the smaller gloves did help smaller fighters. So some of these guys where you think, how could they give up that much weight against a big puncher and get away with it? It was like, well, if you have technique and you can actually land your shots and you can't block as easily in the smaller gloves, you can't you see it in mixed martial arts. Hooks come around the guard. You can't just like shell up very easily. You have to do some torso work unless you want to just eat hooks around the sides of those gloves. So that's also a factor too. The rules have been different over time, but back in the day, no extra muscle, because stamina was so important. No extra muscle, especially in the years when title fights tended to be longer, 20 rounds, 25 rounds, 45 rounds. Once in a while, finish fight. And that's not just championship fights. Sam Langford's third fight with Jim Flynn was booked for 45 rounds. That wasn't a title fight.
Yeah.
And so, you know, so I think as time has gone on, the gloves have gotten bigger, and honestly, steroids have come into the picture and stuff, and diets change. People can know how to eat to bulk very specifically. It's gotten easier to move up in weights over time, at least. But guys used to just have to kind of jump up, and they weren't going to put on a bunch of bulk because it would ruin the fighter they were. Johnson was a little different because he did get more heavy set, but his cleverness was his biggest asset, and he never lost that.
Yeah, and you know, with Johnson also, because you mentioned the gloves, I think that would alter certain things stylistically for him as well, because he's used to having the thumb loose, you know, on the gloves or whatever, even when they were a little bit bigger, like maybe his training gloves and all this stuff. But he fought in a world where you got the like 4 to 6 ounce or whatever, and he's fought in a world where you have some that had more padding on them. But that being said, the thumb was loose, so he can operate a little bit differently if he had to adjust. Of course, he's smart enough that he would be the type to adjust to not being able to have that mobility in his thumbs or whatnot. But that being said, those are all the types of things that factor in, which makes it astonishing, challenging, and all the more interesting when you're looking at some of these potential fantasy fights and all of that stuff.
Yeah, and the way that styles interacts probably different with the different versions of the rule set and equipment.
Yeah.
Maybe the general patterns hold, but certainly the factors are different, especially the smaller gloves where, so like if you take Langford, famously hard punching, you put him in larger gloves, yeah, he's still going to crack a good punch, but
yeah,
he didn't ruin his hands. You know, he was a point of the chin kind of puncher. Like he was pretty precise. He wanted to preserve his hands. He got that good advice from, I think, George Byers, you know, hit him on the point of the chin when you can, you know, to get him right out of there. So maybe in the larger gloves, distributing the pounds per square inch out a little bit. Maybe it's different for him, but in his own day, with that equipment, it was something scary. Same with Bob Fitzsimmons.
Right.
Who knows what he'd be doing in 12-ounce gloves, but he wasn't fighting in 12-ounce gloves that I'm aware of. Maybe some of the exhibitions, but his fights.
Likely going to be some 4 ounces or something like that. So just think about that, you know what I'm saying? Not even from how you're receiving it, but how you're delivering it as well. But yeah, man, that's some serious stuff, you know?
Yeah, and when the Australian promoter, Hugh McIntosh, when he opened the club in the Olympia Club in London, I think it opened in 1910, but Langford fought there in 1911. You know, he was using 6-ounce gloves instead of the 4-ounce that the National Sporting Club had been using in London. And they were saying in the papers, oh, it's going to be less knockouts. And it did work out that way. And that's going from 4 to 6. That's not a big jump compared to today in glove size. But it did make a difference. Yeah. They knew it. They noted it. So that is definitely something to think about, that today being super enormous is really a benefit, because these gloves are big. That means your guard can be impenetrable if you're big enough virtually. So you're just exchanging on the guard and you're like, well, I'm bigger, I'll wear you down. That wasn't always possible, quite that style. So I think, yeah, being bigger is more of an advantage now. Whereas you go back far enough, being bigger means you're less mobile, and those little gloves will get around, especially if you allow kidney punches.
Oh yeah,
You
definitely.
can melt some guys down, and the years before that was banned. Big guy or not, no one likes getting punched in the kidney. And if you're not mobile and the other guy is, he's going to target these sensitive areas. Fitzsimmons had some favorite targets. And in those small gloves, he could put the precision on there. And yeah, so it's definitely a different era. But Johnson was so clever. I think he would do well in any era.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I think so as well. Hey, Dan mentions Langford had huge shoulders and super long arms, gave him leverage. So yeah, that's a good point. You brought this up there, random. But when you think about some of these fighters, yeah, everything wasn't created equal, and I think that's what makes it so great because you have different body variations. You think about Sonny Liston, who we were mentioning. He's about 6'1", 6'2" ish, really 6'1" ish, but he had an 84-inch reach. You think about him. You think about a guy like Deontay Wilder, who's 6'7", he has like an 85-inch reach, right? Or 84, 85-inch reach. So just think about Sonny Liston, just think about those variations. But there is a little training footage out there where you see Langford, he's messing around, he's pushing guys around there with one hand, just kind of doing this number right here, and you get to see him. Proportionally speaking, yeah, he was a solidly thick guy, right? So I think that stuff factors in when you think about it, and also random. And that's one of the things when you think about some of the greatest of all time, and especially when you get down to thinking about the greatest and all of that stuff. He started at a very low weight relative to what people think, and then he was able to put on the right size, and he wasn't the biggest, but he packed enough of a punch that he can knock out these bigger guys who were associated with his era or whatever it may be.
Yeah, he just had a specific confluence of events where this clever, tough, incredibly tough guy could already take care of himself before he even got in the ring. Got all this experience in a rich Boston scene, the New England area, and then as he grew, because he started young, as he grew into adulthood, he grew into a triangle of muscle. But he had so much experience, and again, he's incredibly tough. He had a good manager. So all those things came together. So by the time he's competing at heavyweight, he has physically no business there, unless you only look in his upper body. But he has the technique, he has the power, and he has the physique to just throw destruction. There's some famous photos of Joe Louis and Sam Langford when Louis was chasing the title, and you can see Langford's older, but the width of his body, it looks like a cartoon. He's much shorter than him, but you can see the width of his body. You can just kind of realize that under there is the frame that was absolutely terrifying to people, and even to the point where people would question whether or not he was heavier than he was saying he was, because they see him in person without a shirt on, and they're just like, there's no way you're that light. But of course, if you go to the gym, you see the shorter guys who are real wide. They don't look that small in the gym because you're seeing the top of their shoulders. You're seeing this endless plains of muscle. He was a little bit like that, except he was
right.
at his best. He was still pretty trim, but he had a terrifying physique, and he knew, like one of your listeners was saying, long arms, big shoulders, long arms, and just a wide, big old cavernous chest. And that's a recipe for punching power. Especially we multiply it by experience of having fought great fighters at the lower weights,
right?
But then grown into a musculature that would allow him to fight at heavyweight. But he's faster than they are because he's smaller, but he's wider than they are. He actually can hit harder. Like I was saying earlier, you have to game plan against him.
Yeah, all of that factors in. Like, you can't teach that type of experience and stuff like that, because you're right. You can't teach Sam Langford earlier in his career fighting Joe Gans. You can't teach that. That's just something that organically happens, right? And we know what Joe Gans was. We know the time period that was early in Langford's career. You can't teach Sam Langford going up against a Jack Blackburn or something like that. You know what I'm saying? So that's why it's so different right there, because that just early in your career. Just imagine fighting those type of guys. When he fought Joe Lewis, I'm pretty sure was already at 100 plus fights in, right? So just think about that. That's not stuff
Wait.
you
Who do you mean? You said Joe Lewis.
not
So
Joe
you
Lewis,
mean
sorry,
Joe Gans?
Joe Gans rather. When Langford fought Joe Gans, wasn't Gans already 100 plus fights in?
Yeah, I think he was over 150, and
Yeah, so you
there's a
can't.
lot.
That's like stuff you can't teach that level of experience or whatever. You can get a fighter up to a certain point or whatever, but to go in with someone like that early in your career and to actually compete, that's crazy. That's different.
Yeah, it's just he had a unique thing, but Joe Walcott had done a similar thing, but
Oh
Langford
yeah,
maxed out at a larger size.
yeah.
So even though Walcott could fight some heavyweights, he wasn't a top heavyweight, whereas Langford
Hmm.
was a top 2 to 4 heavyweight for years in a row, depending on his most recent results with the other top guys.
Yeah, and as game is like a Walcott was, he was going to run into like some size constraints at some point, depending on the level of a fighter and skill set of the fighter they was fighting. Because at the end of the day, 5'1" is 5'1", you know?
Yeah, and Walcott, though he had a big chest and decently long arms for his size, he was just a smaller version. So Langford was like an upgrade. He was
Yeah.
Terminator 2, you know what I mean? He was,
Right.
and so,
Good way
but
of putting
there was precedent for smaller fighters moving up, including Tommy Burns. Well, Marvin Hart, who Tommy Burns took the second iteration of the title from, they both graduated into that class.
it. Mm-hmm.
So Langford wasn't alone. It's just that he was in a rich era, and he fought his 2 greatest rivals 29 times between the two of them
Insane to
across their
think about
careers.
that number.
And then had
Just
other rivalries too. It's just a lot of those rivalries weren't competitive. Like with Jim Barry, where the best he ever got with Langford was a draw, mostly losses.
oh
So
yeah,
then it was a rivalry. Barry was a tough cookie, but that,
people aren't going to know about Jim, you know?
yeah, he was a tough one. So Langford had other rivalries, but his 2 greatest rivals to him, Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh, 29 fights between the pair of them. That's a whole career of fights today against a pair of Hall of Fame heavyweights. So that's what
Mm-hmm.
sets Langford apart, is he walked the walk. Because they were all being shut out, it just worked out that the biggest fights he could get were against these great fighters. And so, it's not like he was like, I want to do this. He wanted to fight Johnson. He wanted the crack of that title. But what he ended up doing was, yeah, exactly, Dan. Jim Barry was a tough cookie.
Right. You had
And he was
guys
even
like
able
that.
to knock Langford down in a couple of their fights. So it wasn't like he wasn't a scrub. It's just that Langford was a really tough puzzle and a little bit too tough for Barry.
Right.
Battling Jim Johnson's another one. Tough guy. Fought a tremendous dozens of fights against Hall of Fame heavyweights, but like he just couldn't get past Langford. He could draw with him and mostly lost. But
Yeah, sometimes the records they can misconstrue things, but some of these guys, yeah, even though they had a lot of losses, you got to look at who they were in with and how much does the how much do you weigh loss to a Sam Langford versus just any run of the mill person? You know what I'm saying? So those are the types of things you got to think about when you see these guys with these losses, because hey, there's always going to be a runner up and then those beyond that, you know, because everybody can't get to the throne right there. So you're going to have a lot of guys who are fighting around that era, taking on such tough competition. And we can do comparables here in this modern time. So when you think about a guy like Jim Barry or whatever, Iron Haig or something like that, they're not names that many are going to notice or remember given the time frame that it's passed or whatever. But these are tough guys who their living was fighting. So think about that. They were fighting for a living.
yeah, and actually, while we're on the cut line business, so then we have Iron Haig's interesting. So Gunnar Moir, who was the English heavyweight champ prior
Oh yeah,
to him, didn't want to fight Langford. Langford had been there in 1907. He didn't want any.
Gunner. Yep.
Beat a common opponent, Tiger Smith, a Welsh guy who was in the army, the Indian Army, or British Army in India. But he beat him, but Gunnar didn't want it. But then Gunnar lost to Iron Haig, who did agree to fight Langford in May 1909, you know, as a replacement fight for Johnson. So credit to him for not drawing the color line. But the day after the fight, he did then draw the color line, claiming that it basically, not copying his language, but to paraphrase him, the black guys, their heads were too hard. Because I guess one of his hands was twice its former size the next day when they met to settle the money. But he drew the line, but he didn't draw it up front. It was after the fact. So that counts for something too. There's another version of the color line for y'all, folks.
No,
One induced. Actually, Willie Lewis did that as well. Willie Lewis fought Langford in February of 1904 when he was a prospect. But after that, he drew the color line. The papers, I saw them note that.
Interesting.
Langford basically punched him across the line.
I'm surprised right there because Willie Lewis, he's a tough, he was a hell of a fighter, very tough fighter, would be world champion in pretty much any era, any other era, but he was just in an era of tough competition, you know?
Yeah, good fighter. But when he lost to Langford, he was more of a prospect.
Yeah.
He'd already had a couple setbacks, but I saw in the paper later where he didn't want the fight. And they were saying, well, he didn't draw the line before. There are lots of interesting instances like that where, like Tommy Sullivan, who's from Lawrence, Massachusetts, I believe, who Langford fought. He turned down a Langford fight, but then he took him short notice when he was supposed to fight Jack Blackburn. Blackburn took ill, Langford stepped in, and then he lost badly to him, got beat up. And so the color line was situational. And sometimes the same guy has a lot of different positions on the matter. It's out of convenience. There's no principle involved other than self-interest. There's nothing noble about it.
Similar thing happened. I was mentioning Peter Jackson earlier. So there's this guy, Joe McAuliffe, Mission Boy Joe McAuliffe. He was he had drew the color line, said, he wasn't gonna fight a black fighter, and then they gave him enough money. He changed his mind. He fought Peter Jackson. He got stopped. But ultimately he took the fight. They offered him enough money. He was like, hey, you know what? I'll take it. You know what I'm saying? So sometimes, you had those instances. If it's convenient for you, okay, but enough money, they could change change the thought process, I would say.
Yeah, and Jimmy Britt, the California lightweight I'd mentioned, he wasn't even the champ. He was the rival claimant, but he was drawing the color line on Gans at first.
Which is wow. Jimmy Britt, and he's a super tough fighter with an amazingly tough career.
But he wasn't even champion. He's drawing the line, and
right.
So it's interesting how the different versions of this thing, different versions of the excuses.
And check that video out, folks, if you haven't. But Random and I, we did a discussion on Jimmy Britt. Jimmy Britt, hell of a resume right there for a fighter. He didn't have. He may have had 20 fights. I think it was a little bit under that, even maybe around 20 fights. But man, talking about one of the toughest 20 fight resumes in boxing history, Jimmy Britt is that. And that was a good discussion right there, Random, when we had that, because I think it revealed a lot of stuff on a guy who's fairly obscure, but man, he had an impact, and especially considering the competition he faced in such a short career total fight-wise,
Yeah, his career more mirrors like a modern career. And he actually had a short, I think he was only an amateur for like a year.
Yeah, like Lomachenko.
He was a big name by the time he turned pro.
Yeah. Imagine Lomachenko competition level at that particular time.
Say that again.
Like Vasily Lomachenko, where he was fighting a lot of tough competition right there from the jump.
Right, just jump straight in. So, interestingly, Britt was the master of ceremonies for Langford's fight in 1911 in London against Bill Lang at the Olympia Club, where I mentioned they used the 6-ounce gloves. Jimmy Britt was in his tux. You can see him in the footage. He's there. He's the master of ceremonies.
No, I had to look back on that. That's crazy. That is crazy. I'm gonna look back on that. That's the only footage of him, right? That we know of. Really.
Yeah, it might be. I don't know though.
That's crazy. I'm gonna look back on that now. And so the Bill Lang contest. Okay, he's in the tux. Wow, that's crazy. I didn't know that. Random. Thanks for sharing that. You hear that, folks? You get these little nuggets you never knew of. You get Jimmy Britt. He's on video, at least not fighting, but that being said, he's still on video. Crazy.
Yeah, and we mentioned our last show talking about hand wraps, and you can see in the footage of that, Bill Lang comes in the ring, takes a look at his gloves. I think they shake hands first,
Oh
but
yeah.
they take a look at the gloves, man. But speaking of the color line, so Langford in his prime, he was trained by George Byers and Bob Armstrong, both of whom had held the heavyweight color championship. And Bob Armstrong was one of the trainers for James J. Jeffries' return fight when he came back against Johnson in 1910. So sometimes these guys, they were in the mix. They just couldn't get the actual fights for themselves. But as training partners and coaches and things, some of these guys were very important.
Yeah, and that's funny. There's some post-fight career footage. Shout out to Fight Films, a guy Carl Weingarten. He's got that footage of Gunboat Smith sparring with Bob Armstrong. Armstrong, of course, this is more trainer phase Armstrong, post fight career Armstrong, but it's pretty insane to be able to even see it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, exactly.
Insane stuff. At random, we've been going 2 hours 15 minutes. Hey, man, this has been a great discussion right there. Maybe we'll have to wrap this thing up right here, random, because I know you have,
Yeah, I got work. I got to be in the office super early. Let's call it. But this was a good time, man. I appreciate you having me on.
Oh yeah, no, this is great, random. Hey, it's always a pleasure having you on. Real quick, Dan mentions I think he lost sight to Red Brick out West Fighter. Oh yeah, got you there, Dan. Dan mentioned Jim Mace taught Fitzsimmons. Yes, indeed. But Fitzsimmons got discovered for fighting in, I believe it was 2 tournaments of Jim Mace's, but certainly in that first tournament with Jim Mace, Fitz was discovered, and from there, I guess you could say the rest is history. But no, that's good stuff there. Dan mentioned out west, especially San Francisco. A lot of fights not recorded, and lots of exhibition made more money that way. Britt, Corbett, Jeffries. Oh yeah, no doubt. So yeah, so much stuff that probably wasn't recorded there for sure, and that could be its own thing. And random even found a fight of Sam Langford that wasn't on like the likes of BoxRec and all that stuff here a couple of years ago that we had documented. Anyway, though. Random, man, this has been a hell of a discussion there, Random. Now I would be remiss if I didn't, in closing, ask about how things are going. I know you, and I want you to mention, of course, so the people know you are working on a book that will feature none other than the man who came up in this, Sam Langford.
Yeah, just working on his rise to prominence, his rise through the weights, and it's going well. I'm just still filling in, making sure I got all the quotes typed in that I intend to use, connecting the quotes largely.
Mm-hmm.
It's going good. I don't know when the first draft is going to be finished, but I'm just plugging away at it. And it's very rewarding. And I'm unfortunately, I've gathered so much. There's a lot of interesting stuff I'm going to have to leave out of the book. It's just not
I bet
tenable to have it all in there and have it be coherent. But I enjoy learning that stuff too, even if I can't always share it in that format. I talk about some of it on here, but yeah, a lot of interesting stuff, a lot of drama in those days. It wasn't so simple as it might seem looking back, especially if you're looking back at a publication that's ignoring the colored lineage at championship level. It doesn't look as thrilling as it perhaps was week to week, as these guys were often fighting busy schedules and a lot of stuff was happening. So yeah, it's an interesting time. I always love talking about this time with you, man. It's one of the rich eras in the sport.
Oh yeah,
want to do this again.
Yes, indeed, they're random. So no, I appreciate you, and of course, I appreciate everyone else who came in, showed us some love, who hit that like, who subscribed, anything associated with that. Those that will be listening on the replay, you are appreciated. Feel free to drop comments. We're gonna talk about this stuff. We're gonna continue to discuss it. And hey, if you have other topics you want us to discuss just in general, be sure to hit us up, because hey, we're for diving into it without question. So we thank everyone. And of course, we want everyone to have a great end of their night and weekend that is right around the corner there, folks. So appreciate you all. So shout out to everyone. Have a good one.